They thought it would be just another freedom of navigation patrol. April 24th, 2025. The USS William P. Lawrence, a guided missile destroyer, cuts silently through the Taiwan Strait. It's early morning, the sea's calm, skies clear, but tension? You could cut it with a knife. Then, China speaks up. Not just words, a full press statement from the PLA's Eastern Theater Command. Translated loosely, "We see you, and we're not happy." The Chinese military announces it's deployed naval and air forces to shadow and warn the American destroyer. Live updates flood state media. Footage leaks. Radar tracks are published. The message is clear. You're not welcome here. But the U.S. response? Radio silence. No press briefings, no dramatic tweets, just the Lawrence staying her course like nothing happens. What China calls provocation, the U.S. Navy calls routine. But this was no routine on Tuesday. Because that destroyer wasn't just making a point about freedom of navigation. It was walking straight into contested waters that Beijing claims as its own. A move that could escalate from saber-rattling to sparks in seconds. So what really happened out there? Was this a near miss? A warning shot, maybe? Or something more? Because behind the headlines and official statements was a game of cat and missile. And someone blinked. The Lawrence didn't flinch. While headlines in Beijing screamed about illegal trespassing and serious provocations, the destroyer held course. Not an inch off the planned transit path. No evasive maneuvers, no increase in speed. Just a steady, deliberate glide through the strait, right where international law says she belongs. The message was silent, but unmistakable. We don't ask permission. To the U.S. Navy, this wasn't an escalation. It was Tuesday. Freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs, are standard play in contested waters. They're how the Navy draws invisible lines in the sea and dares anyone to say otherwise. The South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, U.S. destroyers have passed through them all calmly, legally, and very much on purpose. And they don't do it alone. As the Lawrence moved east to west through the Taiwan Strait, she wasn't broadcasting her presence, but she wasn't hiding either. Her radar signature was clean. Her AIS beacon was off, but military satellites overhead were feeding live situational data back to the Pentagon. Eyes in the sky, ears under the water, and probably a Virginia-class submarine somewhere nearby, riding silently beneath the waves. You don't walk into someone else's claimed territory without a few backup plans. And China knew it. Within hours of the Lawrence's passage, China media released drone footage, grainy clips of a planned Type 52D destroyer tailing the U.S. ship at a distance. Reports claimed Chinese J-16 fighters had buzzed the area, close but not close enough to trigger a response. PLA Air Force pilots love to get close. But there's a line, and everyone knows where it is. Because if one of those jets had flown too close, if one of those planned ships had tried to block the Lawrence's course, the situation could have gone sideways fast. The rules of engagement in the Taiwan Strait are finely tuned, but fragile. One wrong radar lock, one misread maneuver, and the next thing you hear isn't a diplomatic statement, it's the Aegis combat system going hot. And if that happens, well, the Chinese wouldn't be the only ones watching. Because this isn't just about Taiwan. It's about proving who gets to move through international waters without asking for a hall pass. And the U.S. didn't come to play defense. The Lawrence completed her transit in less than 12 hours. No incident, no deviation. But make no mistake, the silence wasn't peace. It was pressure, building. And the next move was already underway. Just as the USS William P. Lawrence disappeared into the Pacific haze, another pressure point lit up. A few hundred miles south on the other side of the Luzon Strait, warships were on the move. The Philippines and the United States were launching Exercise Balikatan, their largest joint military drill to date. More than 14,000 troops, dozens of ships, fighter jets, missile batteries, and amphibious assault rehearsals across land and sea. The timing? No accident. Within hours of China's announcement that it had shadowed and warned the U.S. destroyer, U.S. Marines were unloading HIMARS rocket systems onto a Philippine beach. A show of force? Absolutely. But also a message to Beijing. We're not just sailing through the Taiwan Strait, we're building firing positions just over the horizon. In military planning, that's called shaping the battle space. And China was paying attention, especially since it had just flexed its own naval muscles a few days earlier. A carrier strike group led by the Shandong, one of the PLA Navy's most modern aircraft carriers, had just cruised past the Philippines' northern coast, well within the country's exclusive economic zone. The move sent a jolt through Manila, prompting immediate air patrols and radar sweeps. The message was clear: we can flank you from both sides. But the Philippines didn't back down. While the PLA was releasing propaganda footage of their intercept, U.S. Pacific Command was compiling ISR data from satellites, drones, and surface vessels. Every maneuver, every flyover, every tailing ship, logged, tagged, filed. And behind every polite statement from the Pentagon was a quiet question being whispered in the planning rooms from Okinawa to Guam. How far is China willing to go this time? Because if these weren't war games anymore, if this was the opening act of something worse, then every move, every destroyer, every joint drill, every carrier group deployment wasn't just a deterrent, it was a dress rehearsal. And just beyond the political theater and all the flashing headlines, steel was moving across the sea fast. Beijing didn't blink, but it didn't stay quiet either. As the USS Lawrence exited the Taiwan Strait and U.S. and Allied forces ramped up exercises just offshore, the Chinese Communist Party kicked into overdrive. The PLA's Eastern Theater Command issued a second statement, this time sharper, louder, more direct. The words illegal, provocative, and irresponsible weren't suggestions, they were accusations. In state media, anchors in Navy uniforms warned of hostile infiltration. PLA mouthpieces called the destroyer transit a dangerous show of muscle, meant to intimidate and disrupt regional peace. But behind the dramatic language was something colder, the framing of a narrative. China wasn't just upset that a U.S. warship sailed through what they call their territory, they were angry that it did so without asking. You see, in Beijing's view, the Taiwan Strait isn't international water. It's a domestic corridor, part of what they call their internal sea. And they've been working hard for years to convince the world that the rules there are different, that freedom of navigation doesn't apply, that warships from the West need permission to pass. But international law says otherwise. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, which even China has signed, recognizes the Taiwan Strait as an international waterway. And the US? They treat it like a highway, no different than the Strait of Gibraltar or the English Channel. That clash of definitions is not just semantics, it's doctrine. Because if the world accepts that the Taiwan Strait is Chinese territory, then every future transit becomes an escalation, a diplomatic incident, a bargaining chip. But if the US keeps sailing through, unchallenged, unapologetic, then Beijing's narrative starts to erode. And right now, the US isn't just sailing through. It's doing so while regional allies drill live fire exercises to the south, and ISR platforms match every inch of the coastline to the north. That's not a coincidence. That's counter-pressure. So while Beijing shows footage of J-16s flying combat patrols near Taiwan and warships shadowing American destroyers, the reality is less cinematic and more strategic. They're trying to set the tempo. But the tempo is hard to maintain when you're reacting. And China, well, it was reacting. Reacting to the transit, reacting to the drills, reacting to the idea that its own coastline was no longer a wall, but a window. And through that window, the US Navy was watching. The Taiwan Strait stayed calm. By the time the USS William P. Lawrence cleared the eastern edge of the strait, the region wasn't just holding its breath, it was watching for the next move. Not with speeches, with satellites, with sonar, with the kind of scrutiny you only apply when everyone suspects something bigger is coming. Because here's the truth. That single transit didn't change the map. It changed the tone. It shifted the rhythm. And in geopolitics, rhythm matters. In Beijing, the PLA began rotating assets faster than usual. Frigates that had been docked for maintenance were suddenly at sea. Aerial patrols increased. Even civilian ferries in the Taiwan Strait began reporting unmarked radar interference, possibly signals from airborne early warning systems sweeping for US subs. And on the American side, Strike Group 5 didn't slow down. The Lawrence rejoined its formation, which included the aircraft carrier USS Carl Vinson, steaming east with an escort wall of steel and eyes in every direction. In the air, P-8 Poseidons looped over potential launch corridors, their onboard radar scanning for missile signatures, surface skimmers, or worse, coordinated swarms. And in the middle of all this, Taiwan quietly upgraded its defense posture. No sirens, no press briefings, just subtle moves. More intercept flights by ROCAF jets, increased activity around known radar sites, logistics hubs running hotter than usual. Even the roads leading to mountainous bunkers saw more military traffic than usual. Everyone was preparing. Because while no missiles flew and no shots were fired, the rules of the game had shifted. Before, China operated under the assumption that the US was risk-averse in the region, that Washington would flinch at escalation, that a loud enough warning would cause hesitation. But the Lawrence didn't hesitate. It transited the strait with the kind of clinical professionalism that says one thing loud and clear: we're not asking. And if that becomes the norm, then China's entire strategy, its bluffing game, its gray zone operations, its salami slicing of strategic control, starts to unravel. Because when your enemy stops fearing your reaction, you lose your leverage. Beijing knows this. That's why the propaganda was so loud. That's why the flyovers were pushed to the edge of too close. That's why the video of a planned destroyer tailing the Lawrence was played on a loop in state news, as if to say, we're still in control. But control isn't about tailing a ship. It's about shaping what that ship does next. And right now, the only ones shaping movement in the region are wearing US Navy patches. Which leads us to the bigger picture. Because this wasn't just a standoff, it was a stress test. The US was testing Beijing's willingness to escalate, testing how far the PLA would actually go before blinking, testing whether the strait, long time a flashpoint for speculation, would actually erupt under pressure. It didn't, but the seams showed. Increased comms chatter, odd force deployments, a spike in cyber probe activity across US and allied digital infrastructure, all detected in the hours after the transit. Beijing was rattled. Not panicked, but rattled enough to double-check its playbook. And here's where it gets interesting. That playbook? It used to assume time was on China's side, that eventually the US would tire of playing sheriff in the Pacific, that Taiwan would feel isolated. that regional alliances would drift apart under economic pressure. But now, time might not be China's friend. Because every exercise like the Bala-Katan adds teeth to a regional shield. Every destroyer that sails through the Taiwan Strait without blinking pushes back the red line. And every time China tries to intimidate with a jet flyby or a destroyer tail, the response isn't retreat, it's reinforcement. The Pacific's getting sharper, faster, less predictable. And when unpredictability becomes the default setting, the chances of a miscalculation skyrockets. One wrong blip on a radar screen, one nervous pilot, one mistimed maneuver, that's all it would take. And suddenly, we're not talking about a routine transit anymore. We're talking about flashpoints, about after-action reports, about war. That's why this matters, because this wasn't just a message between destroyers. It was a message to the world. The lines are being redrawn, and the erasers are moving fast. So here we are. One destroyer, one narrow strait, one message sent without firing a shot. But don't mistake the quiet for calm. The Taiwan Strait is now more than just contested water. It's a stage. It's a pressure valve, a test site for modern deterrence, and everyone's watching to see who blinks next. Because the next incident might not come with a warning, and the response might not come with a press release. This wasn't just about one transit, it was about tempo, initiative, showing that the US Navy still sails where it wants, when it wants, and doesn't check in with Beijing before doing so. So what do you think? Are these operations necessary to keep the peace? Or are we one step away from something we can't undo? Let us know what you think in the comments. And hey, if you want to go one step further and support the channel directly, join the fleet. You'll get loyalty badges, priority replies, and help us bring more real naval stories to the surface. Click join on our channel page and step aboard. Until next time, stay sharp, stay safe, and remember, sometimes peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of steel.